Hi there, welcome back to Boy Meets Quilt. I'm Andrew V. Hansen, and this is the next video in my series of my virtual trunk show. So, in the last video, I showed you my first quilt that I designed myself and then completed it from start to finish. And so once I did that, I realized that's kind of what I wanted to do from now on. I was kind of tired of following other people's patterns, as beautiful as they always are. But I wanted to just kind of see how my own creativity could make some original pieces. And so I made some mini quilts in the time after that. And then I kind of happened upon making this quilt a little bit by accident. So in our guild, in the Brooklyn Quilters Guild, one of the charitable activities that the guild does is a committee for comfort quilts. And this committee basically gives you half of the squares required for a quilt, and then you provide the other half of the squares, and you put them all together into a top. And then the committee goes ahead and has them sandwiched and quilted, and then gives them to people in need. It's a beautiful charity, and the committee does a great job. And so one of the great things I love about that guild, and specifically that comfort quilt committee, is that it gives me a chance to use a lot of the fabrics that I've been buying that I don't know what else I'm going to do with them. And so I had done a couple comfort quilt tops in the past, and then I got another pack of squares, fabric squares, and I wanted some purples, and I decided I had started playing around with improv piecing in some previous squares that I had done for another quilt. And so I thought, oh, I'll make some improv pieced purple squares with some purple fabric that I have. And so I ended up making 6 of these squares here you see in the quilt, and I loved them so much that I did not use them for the comfort quilt, and I assure you I used other fabric and completed that quilt. But I kept these for myself, and I realized I wanted to make a whole quilt based off of those improv squares. And I also decided I wanted it to be rainbow themed. And so, you know, if anyone follows quilting on Instagram, you know that rainbow quilts are a whole big thing. And I wanted to take part in that phenomenon. So these purple squares were the first ones I started with. And then I just basically did the same technique for all of the rest of the squares in the spectrum. And so basically all I did for this particular block is I took 3 different shades, tints of the same hue, and I cut them into 2.5-inch strips, and I pieced them all together into a pretty much kind of like a fat quarter-sized piece of fabric. And then I just kind of went crazy and improv pieced, or improv cut, all the strips apart and sewed them back together in random configurations, and came up with, and then I squared them off to the size that I wanted. And I think they turned out really cool. And so, and this was all kind of flying by the seat of my pants. I kind of didn't know how this was going to end up when I first started making these squares. And as I made them, I realized the vision of the quilt started to happen, and I realized I wanted them to kind of be spaced apart. I didn't want them all mixed together. And so I had some of this gray left over from the quilt you saw in the previous video, and so I bought some more, of course, and this is how I feel quilters end up with signature colors, is that they make a quilt out of a particular color or set of colors, and they have just enough left over that they want to use it for a different quilt, but not enough to actually complete the quilt, so they have to order more of that color, and it goes on and on and on until suddenly all of your quilts have this color in it. So for a while, this gray pops up in a lot of my quilts. And so I then used the EQ8 software again, just to kind of get an idea of how I wanted it spaced out, how much fabric I was going to need for the quilt that I ended up making, because I made these squares, but I didn't know how they were going to, how much space I wanted in between, and that would then dictate the overall size of the quilt. And as I was putting it together, I realized this was kind of going to be big enough to be a bed quilt. And so this was by far the largest quilt I had made up to this point. And once I realized it was going to be big enough for my bed, I did some extra measuring and then I spaced things accordingly. Now you'll notice these border strips here. These are just the result of all of the scraps I collected while I was piecing my blocks. And I kind of loved this idea of creating a border all the way around. Well, it turns out I didn't have enough scraps for an entire border. So I ended up just doing these corners with the border strips. And I think that actually turned out to look much cooler than an entire border of that. I love this quilt. I love seeing it every day on my bed, especially when the sun's shining on it. So let's take a closer look. All right, so here you can see the top of the quilt, and we're gonna come in closer to get a look at the free motion quilting that I did. You'll also notice for the binding, I had a little fun with some rainbow stripes, but I just did this 4 times in the binding, close to each of the corners. So if we go along here, the top binding, there's all gray, and then we get to another little bit of rainbow, and then the corner. And that goes all the way around the quilt. And I think that's just a fun little touch. Then you can see with the free motion quilting, I left most of the quilt fairly open quilting, not a lot of dense quilting. I do like the 3 different strands of wavy lines that kind of interweave together in random patterns. I think that's kind of a fun design, and it was an easy way to quickly quilt most of the quilt. For each block, I outlined them in their corresponding color with a double border. So I did that for each of the blocks. So I ended up doing that for the rainbow strip as well. And since it was a rainbow strip, I used a variegated thread that goes through the primary colors of red, yellow, and blue. And then to connect those strips, I did kind of these sine waves of sound or light, whatever you're thinking when you look at this quilt, connecting them, which I think is kind of cool. And then up here along the main border of the quilt, I did some more of these curves that you saw in my sampler quilt in one of the squares, and then had just some straight line stitching all the way around the border to frame the entire quilt. Then for each of the blocks, I chose one color in each of the blocks and quilted only in that color. So for this pink one, I chose the middle pink color, and I chose a certain motif that was specific to each color. So for this one, it's kind of like a little paisley motif that I only stitched in the middle pink colors. For the orange, I did these curves here that are close together. So the color blocks only have quilting in one particular color, and the rest is left unquilted. Because again, I personally like a mix of dense quilting and then no quilting, so that there's more texture and variety, both visually and also when you feel it. I don't know about you, but feeling a quilt is a lovely experience. And when your fingers go over something that's densely quilted, but then right next to it is something puffy, I think that's a really fun texture to have on a quilt. And so this is the Caged Cacophony quilt that I designed and put together and quilted myself. And it's on my bed normally when it's not being hung for a video. And I raised it up a little bit more so you can see that the bottom of the quilt just basically is a symmetrical reflection of the top of the quilt. And that's that. I hope you enjoyed the little tour of this particular quilt. And please join me for the rest of my trunk show as these videos continue to appear. And as always, if you have any questions or comments or bits of advice for the community that we're building here on YouTube, please leave them below and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. And thanks so much for watching. See you next time.